You pressed play on this video for a reason. What you're about to discover isn't just another perspective on reality. It's a quantum truth so fundamentally disruptive to everything you've accepted as real that your neural architecture will literally reconstruct itself after you grasp it. Not metaphorically reconstruct, physically reconstruct. Synaptic connections reforming, mental frameworks dissolving, core beliefs about existence crumbling and rebuilding around a truth that contradicts everything consensus reality taught you, yet explains the actual mechanics of what you are and where you exist. This isn't exaggeration. Neuroscience validates that when you encounter information radically incompatible with your current worldview, your brain initiates neural restructuring as it struggles to integrate truth that won't fit existing mental architecture. And the quantum truth you're about to grasp is maximally incompatible with the worldview you were conditioned to accept, making neural restructuring not just possible but unavoidable once comprehension lands. There exists a specific quantum truth that transforms everything once you see it. Not some surface-level quantum mechanics factoid, but an implication of quantum mechanics so profound that fully grasping it erases the boundary between you and reality, between witness and witnessed, between consciousness and physical form. This truth isn't buried in complex equations. This truth is simple, direct, undeniable once it's spoken clearly. But that simplicity makes it more disruptive, not less, because you can't dismiss it as too abstract to grasp or too theoretical to apply. This truth is immediately graspable, and immediate comprehension triggers immediate restructuring. Most humans never encounter this truth stated plainly. They learn fragments of quantum mechanics, the observer effect, wave function collapse, superposition, but never witness how these fragments converge into a single devastating recognition that detonates the classical worldview completely. They maintain separated understanding where quantum strangeness applies to particles in labs, while their daily existence remains governed by classical assumptions about solid matter, separate self, external objective reality. That separation protects the brain from restructuring. But once you perceive the truth that makes separation impossible, once you understand the implication that applies directly to your existence, the brain has no option but to restructure around new understanding because the old architecture can't contain the truth that's been grasped. Can you sense the anticipation mixed with resistance rising in you? One part of consciousness wants to know the truth that changes everything. Another part wants to preserve the comfortable, familiar worldview, even if that worldview is false. The resistance is natural. Your brain prefers stability over accuracy, prefers maintaining existing neural structures over restructuring them. But the consciousness that clicked this video has already chosen truth over comfort, has already committed to knowing even if knowing disrupts everything. That commitment will carry you through the restructuring that follows comprehension. Quantum mechanics isn't merely physics describing how tiny particles behave. Quantum mechanics is a description of reality's fundamental architecture. Architecture that applies to everything, including you, your consciousness, your experience of existence. And when you understand what quantum mechanics actually reveals about witness and witnessed, about measurement and reality, about consciousness and physical manifestation, you discover a truth so radical that the classical worldview can't survive contact with it. The worldview that says you're a separate self, witnessing external objective reality, collapses. And what emerges from that collapse is a recognition so liberating and so terrifying that the brain must restructure to accommodate it. Ancient mystics accessed this truth through direct experience. They attempted communicating it through paradoxes, koans, teachings designed to shatter the logical mind and force recognition beyond conceptual understanding. Modern quantum physics arrived at the same truth through experimental evidence and mathematical proof. Different paths, identical truth. And that truth is, the witness isn't separate from the witnessed. Consciousness isn't separate from reality. You aren't experiencing a predetermined external world. You're participating in generating the experienced world through observation that collapses probability into actuality. Not philosophically, not metaphorically, actually, physically, quantum mechanically. Take a breath, a deep one. Because what comes next states the truth explicitly, states it so clearly that you can't misunderstand, can't dismiss, can't compartmentalize it away from direct application to your existence. And once you understand this truth, once comprehension occurs fully, your brain will begin restructuring. Not instantly. Restructuring takes time as neural pathways reconfigure. But inevitably, because truth incompatible with current worldview forces the brain to choose between denial and restructuring, and consciousness seeking truth chooses restructuring even though it's disruptive. You're about to understand quantum truth that makes denial impossible. Prepare for the great reset. Here's the truth stated directly. You're not a passive witness watching predetermined reality unfold. You're an active participant collapsing the quantum probability field into experienced reality through observation. Before you observe, reality doesn't exist in a definite state. It exists as superposition of all possible states simultaneously. Your observation causes one possibility to collapse from superposition into the definite experience you perceive. You're not discovering what's already there. You're determining what appears through the act of observing. Not sometimes, not occasionally. Every moment, every observation, every experience. Reality doesn't exist independently waiting to be observed. Reality comes into definite existence through your observation collapsing probability into actuality. This isn't interpretation or philosophy. This is what quantum mechanics demonstrates experimentally. The double-slit experiment proves particles exist in superposition until observed, then collapse into definite state when observation occurs. Delayed choice experiments prove observation retroactively determines what happened, even after the event occurred. Quantum eraser experiments prove you can change the past by changing what's observed in the present. All of this converges on the same conclusion. Observation doesn't passively reveal pre-existing reality. Observation actively participates in determining what reality manifests from the probability field. Applied to your experience right now, reading these words, you think you're observing text that exists independently on a screen. But quantum mechanically, before your observation, the screen and text exist as a probability field. Superposition of all possible states, including screen with text, screen without text, screen that's a different color, infinite variations. Your observation collapses that probability into the specific experience of screen with text in this configuration. You're not seeing what exists objectively. You're seeing what your observation collapsed from the probability field. The screen seems independent, but the screen's definite state exists because you observed it, causing collapse from superposition into experienced actuality. This applies to everything, not just quantum particles in a laboratory. Everything is a quantum system. Your body is superposition collapsing through observation into definite sensations. Other people are probability patterns collapsing through your observation into experienced presence. The physical world is a quantum field collapsing into experienced environment through observation that determines which possibilities from superposition become actual. The solidity, the definiteness, the seeming independence of reality, all of this is appearance created by observation collapsing probability, not a pre-existing condition you're discovering. Can you feel your brain starting to resist this? The resistance is predictable. This truth contradicts everything you were taught about being a separate witness of an independent external world. You were taught reality exists objectively, and your observation simply reveals what's there. But quantum mechanics proves that's false. Reality doesn't exist in a definite state until observed. Reality exists as probability, and observation collapses probability into experienced definiteness. You're not a witness of reality. You're a co-creator of reality through observation that determines what manifests from the quantum field of possibility. This recognition dissolves subject-object duality at a fundamental level. There isn't you observing reality, two separate things interacting. There's a unified quantum process where consciousness and physical manifestation are two aspects of a single process. Observation and observed aren't separate. Consciousness and matter aren't different substances. Everything is quantum field. And what you call yourself is a localized consciousness pattern, observing the quantum field and thereby collapsing it into experienced reality that includes the experience of being a separate observer. But that separation is illusion created by the process itself. Your quantum field observing itself and collapsing itself into experienced form through observation. Understanding this truth isn't just learning new information. Understanding this truth destroys the foundational assumption the brain has organized around. The assumption that you're separate from the reality you observe. When that assumption dissolves, every belief, every concept, every understanding built on that foundation becomes unstable. The brain must restructure around a new foundation. You're not separate from reality. You're participating in reality's manifestation through observation that collapses probability into experience. That restructuring is what the Great Reset means. Not that you forget everything, but that everything you know gets recontextualized around the truth that you're not a witness of reality, but a participant in reality's continuous emergence from the quantum probability field. Before the brain can restructure around quantum truth, it will attempt to resist, deny, or compartmentalize the truth to protect the existing worldview. Understanding these resistance patterns helps you recognize when they're operating, so you can move through resistance rather than getting stuck in it. Because resistance isn't wrong. Resistance is a normal protective mechanism. But resistance prevents the restructuring that's necessary for consciousness to evolve beyond the limited classical worldview into quantum understanding that's more accurate even though more disorienting. The first resistance pattern is intellectual dismissal. This is just one interpretation of quantum mechanics, not proven fact. The brain attempts to categorize truth as opinion rather than verified reality. But this dismissal fails when you examine the evidence. Every quantum experiment confirms observation affects outcomes. Every test of quantum predictions validates the mathematics that requires observation-dependent collapse. Copenhagen interpretation, many worlds interpretation, even objective collapse theories, all agree observation plays a crucial role in determining what manifests. The specific mechanism is debated. But that observation affects reality is an experimentally verified fact. not philosophical speculation. The second resistance is compartmentalization. Quantum effects only apply to particles, not to everyday reality. The brain tries to keep quantum truth confined to microscopic scale, to protect the classical worldview about everyday experience. But this compartmentalization is false. Everything is made of quantum particles. Your body, brain, environment, all composed of atoms following quantum rules. Decoherence makes quantum superposition hard to observe at macroscopic scale. But decoherence doesn't eliminate quantum nature. It just makes superposition branches separate rapidly, creating classical appearance from quantum substrate. Your world is quantum. Your observation collapses it. Scale doesn't change that fundamental dynamic. The third resistance is solipsism fear. If I'm collapsing reality through observation, does that mean I'm creating everything and others don't exist? The brain recoils from the implication that seems to make you the sole creator with others being your creation. But this fear misunderstands quantum truth. You're not the sole consciousness collapsing entire reality. You're one node of observation in an interconnected field where multiple consciousnesses simultaneously collapse probability. Others exist as their own observation points collapsing reality from their perspective. What you observe and what they observe overlaps through quantum entanglement, creating shared consistent reality without requiring a single objective reality existing independently. You're not creating others. You're co-creating shared experience with others through multiple observation points affecting the unified quantum field. The fourth resistance is responsibility avoidance. If my observation creates reality, that means bad things happening are my fault. The brain wants to avoid guilt by maintaining that reality is independent of observation, making you a victim of circumstances rather than a participant in manifestation. But quantum truth doesn't mean you consciously control everything that manifests. Most observation is unconscious. Most collapse is determined by probability distributions shaped by past events, by the collective field, by physical laws, not by conscious intention. You participate in collapse through observation, but participation doesn't mean absolute control. Understanding truth isn't about blame. Understanding truth is about recognizing you're not a powerless victim of external circumstances, but a conscious participant affecting probability distributions through how and what you observe. The fifth resistance is existential destabilization. If reality isn't solid and independent, what can I trust? The brain experiences quantum truth as threatening because certainty dissolves. Certainty that you're a separate self. Certainty that reality is objective. Certainty that the past is fixed and the future is predetermined. That dissolution feels like losing ground, losing stability, losing the foundation you've built identity on. But destabilization is necessary for restructuring. The old foundation was false even though comfortable. The new foundation is true even though initially disorienting. The brain will stabilize around quantum truth once restructuring completes. But during transition, destabilization is inevitable and necessary. Recognize these resistances operating in your consciousness right now. Notice thoughts appearing that dismiss, compartmentalize, fear, avoid responsibility, or feel destabilized. That's the brain attempting to protect the existing worldview from truth that threatens it. Don't fight resistance. Don't judge it. Just recognize it's happening. That recognition creates space where resistance can be witnessed without controlling your response. allowing truth to penetrate even while resistance operates. Resistance will dissolve naturally as the brain restructures. Forcing resistance to disappear before restructuring completes just creates more resistance. Allow resistance. Witness it. Continue understanding truth despite resistance. Restructuring will happen naturally if you don't let resistance stop comprehension. Now we deepen understanding by exploring what observation actually means in quantum mechanics. Because misunderstanding observation creates confusion about quantum truth. Most people think observation means consciously looking at something with attention. But quantum observation is more fundamental than conscious attention. Observation is any interaction that could in principle be known by consciousness, whether consciousness is currently attending to it or not. Understanding this clarifies how you're continuously collapsing reality, even when not consciously focusing on most of what you experience. Quantum observation occurs when a system interacts with its environment in a way that creates information that could be accessed by consciousness. A photon hitting your retina creates information that could become conscious sight. A sound wave vibrating your eardrum creates information that could become conscious hearing. A molecule binding to a receptor creates information that could become conscious smell. These interactions cause collapse from superposition into definite states before consciousness becomes aware of what collapsed. By the time consciousness attends to experience, collapse has already occurred through physical interaction that created accessible information. This means you're collapsing reality continuously through billions of quantum interactions per second, not just through occasional conscious attention. Every sensory input, every neural firing, every molecular interaction in the body. All of these are observations in the quantum mechanical sense. Interactions creating information potentially accessible to consciousness, thereby causing collapse from superposition into definite states. Most of this occurs unconsciously, but unconscious observation still collapses probability into actuality. You don't need to consciously focus on something to observe it quantum mechanically. The observation happens through physical interaction, and consciousness becomes aware of already collapsed results. But consciousness isn't irrelevant. While observation can occur unconsciously through physical interaction, conscious attention affects which observations occur and how probability distributions collapse. When consciousness focuses on something, neural activity associated with that focus creates additional quantum observations, potentially affecting probability distributions in ways unconscious observation wouldn't. Conscious intention might influence which possibilities become more probable before collapse occurs. Focused awareness might maintain quantum coherence longer than would occur naturally, allowing different collapse outcomes. Consciousness participates in the quantum process, even though consciousness isn't required for every individual collapse. Applied practically, you're continuously collapsing reality through unconscious observation, sensory input creating the experienced world moment by moment through billions of quantum interactions. But conscious observation adds a layer of influence. What you focus on, how you observe, what you expect to see. These potentially affect probability distributions before collapse, influencing what manifests from the quantum field. You're not consciously creating every detail of experience, but you're participating in determining probabilities through conscious observation, layered on top of unconscious observation that's happening continuously. This resolves the apparent contradiction. If I'm collapsing reality, why doesn't everything I want appear? Because most collapse is unconscious, determined by probability distributions shaped by physical laws, past events, the collective field, not by conscious desire. And conscious observation affects probabilities, but doesn't override them absolutely. You participate in determining what manifests, but participation operates within constraints of quantum probability distributions that aren't unlimited. The participation is real, but participation isn't omnipotent control. You're one factor among many affecting what collapses from the probability field. If you're finding value in this transmission, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this frequency reach more consciousness, ready for the Great Reset. Understanding observation at this level clarifies quantum truth without making it seem magical or unlimited. You're collapsing reality through observation continuously. Most collapse is unconscious. Conscious observation adds influence. Influence operates within probabilistic constraints. All of this is quantum mechanics applied to experience, not supernatural power, not wishful thinking, but the actual process where consciousness participates in determining what manifests from the quantum field through observation that collapses probability distributions into experienced actuality. That participation is more limited than the ego wants, but more real than the classical worldview acknowledges. 7 years ago, I encountered this quantum truth during a physics seminar, and my brain literally reset over the following weeks. I'd studied quantum mechanics before, understood the mathematics, could explain the experiments, but I'd maintained compartmentalization, quantum strangeness for particles, classical reality for experience. Then the professor stated the implication explicitly. You're not observing independent reality. You're collapsing the probability field into experienced reality through observation. This applies to your life, your body, your world, not just to particles in a lab. That statement shattered the compartmentalization, and the brain started restructuring immediately. The initial effect was disorientation so profound, I questioned whether the external world existed. If my observation collapses reality, what exists when I'm not observing? If reality is probability before collapse, what is probability? Is it real or abstract? If others are collapsing their own reality, how does my reality relate to theirs? Questions cascaded faster than answers appeared. The foundation I'd built understanding on, separate, self-observing, independent world, had dissolved. But the new foundation hadn't formed yet. That gap between dissolution and restructuring was destabilizing, disorienting, occasionally terrifying. But disorientation wasn't consciousness breaking. Disorientation was the brain restructuring neural pathways around new understanding incompatible with old structures, like renovating a house while living in it. Temporary chaos leading to better organization. I'd think about an object and notice myself experiencing it as probability collapsing, rather than as an independent thing existing objectively. I'd interact with a person and recognize the interaction as mutual observation collapsing shared reality, rather than as two separate selves encountering each other externally. Every experience became an occasion to witness quantum dynamics operating in direct life, rather than remaining an abstract physics concept. The restructuring took 3 months to stabilize. Initially, oscillation between old classical perception and new quantum perception, sometimes seeing the world as solid and separate, sometimes recognizing it as probability I'm collapsing. Eventually, quantum understanding integrated sufficiently that it became baseline. Not that I consciously think about quantum mechanics constantly, but that perception naturally recognizes I'm participating in reality's manifestation through observation, rather than passively experiencing a predetermined world. The integration wasn't returning to normal. The integration was establishing a new normal where quantum truth is the foundation consciousness operates from. What I learned through that process transformed everything about how I navigate existence. I'm not a powerless witness of circumstances beyond control. I'm a participant affecting what manifests through observation. Not omnipotent, not unlimited, but participating, influencing, co-creating through consciousness that collapses probability into experience. That recognition shifted me from feeling like a victim of external reality to recognizing I'm engaged in a continuous co-creative process with the quantum field. Circumstances don't just happen to me. Circumstances emerge through a complex process I participate in through observation, even though I don't control all variables affecting what collapses. This is what I wish someone had told me before the brain reset occurred. Disorientation is temporary and necessary. You're not losing your grip on reality. You're adjusting to a more accurate understanding of reality's actual nature. Old neural pathways organized around the false assumption that you're separate from reality must dissolve. New pathways organized around the truth that you're a participant in reality's emergence must form. That restructuring creates temporary instability. But instability resolves into more stable, more accurate, more empowering understanding once restructuring completes. Don't resist disorientation. Don't fight confusion. Don't try to return to classical certainty that was comfortable but false. Allow restructuring to complete. Trust that the brain will stabilize around quantum truth once neural reconfiguration finishes. Your restructuring might be gentler or more intense than mine was, might complete faster or slower. But the mechanics are the same. Encountering truth incompatible with existing worldview triggers neural restructuring as the brain attempts to integrate understanding that doesn't fit current structures. That restructuring is what the Great Reset means. Not forgetting everything, not becoming a different person, but recontextualizing everything you know around the foundation that you're not a separate witness, but a participating consciousness collapsing reality through observation. Once the reset completes, you can't return to believing you're merely observing an independent external world, because you've understood truth that makes that belief impossible to maintain. What we're exploring here, this quantum observer effect and the mechanics of consciousness collapsing reality, is just the surface layer of a much deeper system. If you're feeling the resonance of these concepts and want to understand the complete architecture of how consciousness transmits into form, how to shift from unconscious observation to conscious broadcasting, I've mapped out the entire journey in my book, Beyond the Frequencies, a quantum guide to consciousness mastery. It takes you through the 9 master frequencies that govern reality creation, showing you how to move from being trapped in survival static to becoming the field itself. It's linked in the pinned comment below. To support brain restructuring completing successfully, rather than consciousness retreating to the classical worldview to escape disorientation, you need to practice perceiving quantum dynamics operating in direct experience. Because intellectual understanding of quantum truth isn't sufficient for restructuring. The brain needs experiential evidence that confirms truth in lived experience. Needs direct perception of consciousness collapsing reality. Needs felt sense that you're participating in manifestation rather than just understanding a concept about participation. These practices create an experiential foundation supporting restructuring. The first practice is observation awareness. Noticing the act of observing rather than just noticing what's observed. Right now, you're reading words. Instead of focusing only on content, notice that you're observing words. Feel active attention landing on text. Sense consciousness engaging with the screen. Recognize the moment of observation occurring. That meta-awareness of observing creates experiential recognition that observation is an active process, not passive reception. You're not just receiving information. You're actively observing, actively attending, actively collapsing probability into experienced text through the observation process you're now conscious of. The second practice is pre-observation awareness, noticing the moment before something comes into definite experience. When you're about to look around a room, pause before looking. Notice that the space where you're not yet observing has an uncertain quality. You don't know exactly what will be there until you observe it. Then observe and notice how observation brings definite experience into awareness. Before looking at a clock, the space where time would be displayed is uncertain. Then you look, and a specific time appears through observation. That practice creates experiential recognition. The definiteness emerges through observation, rather than existing before observation occurs. The third practice is probability sensing, feeling potential before collapse. Before choosing which direction to walk, which option to select, which word to speak, pause and sense the field of probability where multiple outcomes are possible. Feel the openness before choice collapses probability into definite action. Then make a choice and notice how choosing collapses the probability field into a single manifested outcome. That practice develops experiential recognition of the probability field existing before observation choice causes collapse into definiteness, confirming the quantum nature of reality operating in direct experience. The fourth practice is observation variation, noticing how different observations create different experiences of the same situation. Look at a scene normally. Notice what appears. Then observe the same scene looking for a specific color. Notice how what appears shifts based on observation focus. Then observe looking for movement, for patterns, for beauty, each time noticing how different observation brings different aspects into definite experience from the probability field. Same physical situation, different observations, different experienced realities. That practice demonstrates observation affects what manifests from the quantum field of possibility. The fifth practice is conscious collapse intention, deliberately choosing what to collapse from the probability field. Before entering a room, set an intention about what you want to observe, perhaps noticing beauty or opportunities or connections. Then observe with that intention and notice how experience aligns with intended observation more than would occur through random chance. Not that you control everything that appears, but that conscious intention influences probability distributions, affecting what collapses into experience when observation occurs. That practice develops experiential recognition that consciousness affects manifestation through observation, not just passively receiving whatever appears. The sixth practice is collective observation recognition, noticing how shared observation creates consistent reality. When multiple people observe the same situation, they generally report consistent experience despite each collapsing their own observation. This consistency demonstrates quantum entanglement, creating correlation between different observation points, rather than requiring a single objective reality existing independently. Practice observing something with another person, then comparing experiences. Notice the overlap where shared observation collapsed into consistent experience. and notice variations where individual observations created different experiential details. That practice confirms you're not solipsistically creating everything, but participating with other observers in co-creating shared reality through correlated collapse. Right now, practice one capacity. Close your eyes. Before opening them, notice the uncertainty about what you'll see. Then open your eyes and observe the room. Notice how observation brings definite visual experience into awareness. That simple practice begins training the brain to recognize observation actively collapses probability into experience rather than passively revealing pre-existing reality. Repeated practice creates an experiential foundation supporting brain restructuring around the quantum truth that you're participating consciousness, not separate witness. Something crucial happens during brain restructuring that most people aren't prepared for. Temporary loss of certainty about everything. Not just uncertainty about quantum mechanics or reality's nature. Uncertainty about basic assumptions you never questioned before. Whether you exist as a continuous self, whether the past actually happened as remembered, whether other people are real, whether anything is reliable. This existential uncertainty isn't consciousness breaking. This is a necessary phase of restructuring where old foundations dissolve before new foundations stabilize. But without understanding this is temporary and necessary, uncertainty can trigger retreat to the classical worldview to regain false but comfortable certainty. The uncertainty manifests as questioning continuity. If reality is probability collapsing through observation, do you exist continuously between observations? When you're not observing your body, does the body exist in a definite state or return to superposition? When you sleep, does the world continue existing, or does it exist only when consciousness observes it? These questions have answers in quantum mechanics. But during restructuring, questions arise faster than answers integrate, creating a period where certainty about continuous existence dissolves without new certainty having formed yet. Or uncertainty manifests as doubting memory. If observation collapses present reality, what about the past? Does the past exist as fixed history or as probability that gets collapsed retroactively through present observation? Delayed choice experiments prove observation can affect past quantum events. Does this mean your past isn't fixed, but gets determined by present observation? Quantum mechanics says the past exists as probability until observed, suggesting memory might be collapsing probability about the past, rather than accessing fixed history. That recognition can destabilize certainty about whether the past happened as remembered or is being created through current observation. Or uncertainty manifests as questioning others' existence. If you're collapsing reality through observation, are other people existing independently or appearing through your observation? When they're not in your presence, do they exist definitely or as probability? Are they conscious observers collapsing their own reality, or are they collapsed patterns in reality you're creating? Quantum mechanics confirms others are independent observers through quantum correlations that couldn't exist if they were just patterns in reality you're creating. But during restructuring, that reassurance hasn't integrated yet, leaving temporary uncertainty about whether solipsism is true. The practice during the uncertainty phase is tolerating not knowing without retreating to false certainty. The classical worldview provided certain answers to these questions. You exist continuously. The past is fixed. Others are real independently. Those answers were comforting, but based on the false assumption of objective, independent reality. Quantum truth dissolves those certainties. New certainties will form based on quantum understanding. Where you exist as a pattern in the quantum field, the past exists as a probability pattern affecting the present. Others exist as independent observation points, creating correlated reality. But during transition, old certainties have dissolved, while new ones haven't formed yet. That gap of not knowing is necessary for restructuring. The practice is also recognizing uncertainty as growth rather than failure. Certainty based on a false foundation isn't wisdom, it's comfortable ignorance. Uncertainty arising from encountering truth is more mature than certainty based on unquestioned assumptions. You're not losing understanding. You're outgrowing childish certainty that required reality to be simpler than it actually is. Adult understanding includes uncertainty, paradox, complexity. The uncertainty isn't regression. The uncertainty is progression from false simple certainty toward true complex understanding that includes not knowing as a necessary component. I experienced this uncertainty intensely for 2 months during restructuring, questioned whether I existed continuously or emerged with each observation, doubted whether memories were accurate history or collapsed probability about the past, wondered whether others were real or manifestations in reality I was creating. The uncertainty was destabilizing, occasionally frightening, sometimes overwhelming, but eventually the brain restructured sufficiently that new certainties emerged. Not classical certainties, but quantum certainties, acknowledging probability, superposition, observation-dependent collapse, while still maintaining functional understanding that allows navigating reality effectively. The uncertainty resolved, but only after allowing uncertainty to exist without retreating to classical certainty that was false even though comfortable. What's happening individually as your brain restructures around quantum truth is happening collectively to thousands globally. This isn't an isolated phenomenon affecting random individuals. This is species-wide consciousness evolution, where humanity is restructuring neural structures around quantum understanding, shifting from the classical worldview to quantum recognition. Where enough humans simultaneously undergo the Great Reset, that collective field itself is transforming from being organized around false classical assumptions to being organized around accurate quantum comprehension. Rupert Sheldrake's morphic resonance explains why brain restructuring is occurring for many simultaneously. As more people's brains restructure around quantum truth, the morphic field strengthens, making restructuring easier for others encountering the same truth. The first person whose brain restructured around quantum understanding did so without support, without framework, without validation. Pure cognitive disruption with no cultural context making sense of what was occurring. The second person found restructuring slightly easier because the first person's neural reconfiguration created a pattern in the field. And now, thousands having undergone restructuring, the field contains a clear pattern supporting the Great Reset for anyone encountering quantum truth, clearly stated. You're benefiting from everyone whose brain restructured before yours. From quantum physicists who integrated quantum understanding into neural structures through years of study. From mystics who restructured around direct experience of non-duality that quantum mechanics now validates. From consciousness researchers who bridged quantum physics and subjective experience. From thousands of ordinary people who've encountered quantum truth and allowed brain restructuring rather than retreating to classical comfort. They created the morphic field. They proved restructuring is survivable and beneficial. They demonstrated the brain can restructure around quantum truth without breaking. Their achievement makes your restructuring easier, more supported, more likely to complete successfully. And when your restructuring completes, when neural pathways have reconfigured around the understanding that you're participating consciousness collapsing reality through observation, when the brain has integrated quantum truth as the foundation for perceiving and navigating existence, you strengthen the morphic field for everyone approaching restructuring. Your integration serves the collective, makes restructuring easier for the next person encountering quantum truth, contributes to species evolution from classical to quantum cognitive organization. But there's something else occurring at the collective level that makes this moment unique. Education is shifting toward quantum literacy, quantum computing becoming mainstream, quantum biology revealing quantum effects in living systems, quantum consciousness theories gaining acceptance in neuroscience. What was fringe understanding is becoming established science. This mainstream validation makes brain restructuring easier. You're not restructuring around a belief contradicting all authority. You're restructuring around truth validated by cutting-edge physics and neuroscience. That validation reduces resistance, supports restructuring, makes the transition less isolating, because others understand and confirm the truth you're integrating. This convergence is creating conditions for a collective great reset, where humanity as a species restructures neural structures from classical to quantum foundation. Individual restructuring is the preliminary wave. As more individuals complete restructuring, collective cognitive organization shifts, eventually reaching a threshold where quantum understanding becomes cultural baseline rather than fringe perspective. We're approaching that threshold. Your individual great reset contributes to collective cognitive evolution that's transforming how the species understands reality and self. Take a moment and comment below with this phrase: I choose quantum truth, not as casual interaction, but as energetic declaration, as a signal to the field that you're ready for restructuring, as conscious interruption in the loop of classical conditioning. Your words become vibration in the quantum field, announcing your willingness to undergo the great reset, even though it's disruptive. Share this transmission. Others have encountered quantum truth, but retreated to the classical worldview because disorientation felt like breakdown rather than restructuring. Others are undergoing the Great Reset, but have no framework making sense of uncertainty and destabilization. Others need to know, encountering quantum truth triggers brain restructuring. Disorientation is temporary and necessary. Uncertainty resolves as new neural structures stabilize. You're not breaking. You're restructuring around more accurate understanding of reality's actual nature. There's a choice approaching that determines whether brain restructuring completes successfully or consciousness aborts the process and retreats to the classical worldview. Choice between allowing temporary disorientation while neural structures restructure or seeking refuge in false classical certainty to escape the uncertainty that restructuring creates. Choice between tolerating not knowing until new understanding stabilizes or grasping at comfortable answers that maintain the old worldview even though you've seen truth making that worldview impossible to honestly maintain. This choice can't be made from ego. Ego wants certainty, wants stability, wants to maintain existing structures even if those structures are based on false assumptions. Ego experiences restructuring as a threat because ego's very existence depends on maintaining separate self-identity that quantum truth dissolves. Ego will create every possible rationalization for retreating to the classical worldview. Quantum mechanics doesn't really apply to everyday reality. This interpretation isn't proven. I need to function practically, so I'll just accept classical assumptions. All of these are ego attempting to abort restructuring to protect itself. The choice has to come from consciousness that's committed to truth over comfort, from recognition that's already occurred, from understanding that can't be completely unlearned, even if ego tries to suppress it. That recognition either solidifies into integrated understanding, brain completing restructuring around quantum truth despite ego's resistance, or it gets suppressed back into unconsciousness, where the classical worldview reasserts dominance despite consciousness having glimpsed truth that the worldview is false. The choice is whether the brain restructures around truth or returns to organizing around comfortable falsehood. Ancient traditions describe this as the dark night or crisis of faith, a period where old understanding has dissolved, but new understanding hasn't stabilized, creating a void that's terrifying but necessary for transformation. You can't build a new house on an old foundation. The old foundation must be demolished before the new foundation can be built. But during demolition, there's a period with no foundation at all. That foundationless period is what restructuring feels like. All certainty's gone, no stable ground, nothing to hold on to. Either you trust the process and allow the foundation to rebuild around truth, or you panic and hastily reconstruct the old foundation to regain false stability. This choice becomes easier when you recognize the cost of aborting restructuring. Consciousness that's seen quantum truth but retreated to the classical worldview experiences particular suffering. Not ignorance of truth, but conscious denial of truth. You've understood, you know reality is quantum while forcing the brain to perceive classically, seeing that you're participating consciousness while pretending you're a separate witness. That divided state creates cognitive dissonance more painful than the temporary uncertainty of restructuring. Living from truth is disorienting initially, but aligned ultimately. Living from known falsehood is comfortable initially, but corrosive ultimately. I faced this choice 4 months into restructuring. Ego wanted to abort the process, wanted to return to comfortable classical certainty, wanted to stop experiencing existential uncertainty, wanted to regain stable sense of being a separate witness of an independent world. But consciousness knew you can't unknow quantum truth once understood. You can suppress it, deny it, distract from it, but you can't genuinely return to innocent classical belief. The only path forward is completing restructuring despite discomfort. Aborting would just create worse suffering of knowing truth while living from falsehood. I chose allowing restructuring to complete, chose tolerating uncertainty until new certainties formed, chose trusting that the brain would restabilize around quantum truth once neural reconfiguration finished. And that choice meant enduring months of existential disorientation, of not knowing, of foundations dissolving without immediate replacement. But eventually restructuring completed. New neural structures stabilized. And what emerged was understanding more accurate, more empowering, more liberating than the classical worldview ever provided. The suffering of restructuring was temporary. The benefit of integrated quantum understanding is permanent. Once brain restructuring completes and neural structures have rebuilt around quantum truth, cognition from that foundation looks radically different from cognition based on the classical worldview. Not better necessarily, sometimes more complex and uncertain than classical simplicity, but more accurate, more aligned with reality's actual nature, more capable of perceiving and navigating quantum dynamics operating in direct experience. And consciousness operating from a restructured brain can't return to classical cognition because neural structures have fundamentally changed. Living from a restructured brain means perceiving reality as probability collapsing rather than as independent existence. You look at an object, and instead of unconsciously assuming it exists objectively, consciousness recognizes. This definite appearance emerged from the probability field through my observation. Not as intellectual overlay, but as direct perception, seeing the collapsing process happening continuously as observation brings reality into definite experience moment by moment. Classical perception saw a fixed, independent world. Quantum perception sees a fluid probability field continuously collapsing into experienced actuality through observation. Self-perception transforms fundamentally. Instead of experiencing yourself as a separate solid self, consciousness recognizes, I am a pattern in the quantum field observing the quantum field, and thereby collapsing it into experienced reality that includes the experience of being a separate observer. But that separation is constructed, not fundamental. At the quantum level, no hard boundary exists between me and reality. Both are patterns in a unified field. Both are probability collapsing through observation. Both are process rather than fixed entity. The self remains functional. You can still use I and make decisions. But self is recognized as conventional construct, not absolute reality. Causation becomes recognized as probabilistic co-creation rather than mechanical determination. Events don't simply cause other events through fixed laws. Events create probability distributions where multiple outcomes are possible, and observation participates in determining which outcome manifests through collapse. You're not controlled by the past deterministically. You're influenced by the past probabilistically while participating through present observation in determining what manifests from the probability field. That recognition shifts experience from being a victim of mechanical causation to being a participant in probabilistic manifestation. Time becomes experienced as more fluid than linear. The past exists as a probability pattern affecting the present, not as fixed history determining the present mechanically. The future exists as a probability field being influenced by the present, not as a predetermined outcome waiting to arrive. The present is where observation occurs, where collapse happens, where participation determines what manifests from probability. Classical time experienced the past as burden and the future as fate. Quantum time experiences all temporal moments as probability patterns. Consciousness navigates through observation that collapses probability into experienced timeline. Relationship to circumstances transforms completely. Instead of experiencing circumstances as external conditions happening to you, consciousness recognizes circumstances emerged from the probability field through a complex process I participated in through observation, even though I didn't consciously control all variables. Not that you blame yourself for unwanted circumstances, but that you recognize participation, allowing conscious adjustment of observation patterns to influence probability distributions more favorably. The classical worldview created victim mentality. Quantum understanding creates participatory responsibility. Manifestation becomes recognized as a continuous quantum process rather than an occasional technique. You're always collapsing reality through observation, always affecting probability distributions through consciousness, always participating in determining what manifests from the quantum field. Not just when using manifestation techniques, every moment, every observation, every thought affecting neural activity that's quantum observation affecting the quantum field. The restructured brain perceives this continuous process where the classical brain remained unconscious of constant participation in creating experienced reality. If this content is touching something in you, if these words are landing in a way that feels like remembering rather than learning, then I invite you to subscribe, not just to this channel, but to this frequency, this space, this movement of consciousness restructuring around quantum truth. Because what we're building here isn't content consumption. It's a community of beings undergoing the Great Reset together, supporting each other through the disorientation, celebrating each other's breakthroughs, holding space for the uncertainty that transforms into knowing. I live from a restructured brain now. Reality appears as probability collapsing rather than fixed existence. Self-recognized as pattern rather than separate entity. Causation experienced as probabilistic participation rather than mechanical determination. Time felt as fluid probability rather than linear inevitability. Circumstances recognized as co-created rather than externally imposed. Manifestation seen as continuous process rather than occasional technique. This isn't a constant mystical state. This is baseline cognition after restructuring. The natural way the brain processes experience once neural structures have rebuilt around quantum truth instead of classical falsehood. There comes a point where brain restructuring becomes irreversible, not because classical perception can't temporarily arise, it can when consciousness contracts, but because neural structures have fundamentally changed in ways that can't be completely undone. You can't unlearn what's been integrated at the neural level. You can temporarily forget or suppress. But foundational restructuring around quantum truth creates permanent changes in how the brain processes reality, making complete return to unconscious classical cognition impossible even if ego wishes for that return. This irreversibility happens through neural plasticity, the brain's capacity to reorganize structure and function based on experience and understanding. When you first encounter quantum truth, existing neural pathways organized around classical assumptions remain dominant. But as you practice perceiving quantum dynamics, as you repeatedly recognize observation collapsing probability, as you experientially confirm consciousness participating in manifestation, new neural pathways form and strengthen. Old pathways don't disappear immediately, but they weaken through disuse while new pathways strengthen through repeated activation. Eventually, a threshold is crossed, where new quantum-organized pathways become dominant. Not that classical pathways completely disappear. They remain as possibility when consciousness contracts into limited perception. But quantum pathways become default. The brain automatically processes experience through quantum understanding rather than requiring effort to maintain quantum perception against classical default. At that point, restructuring has become permanent change in neural architecture rather than temporary shift in perspective consciousness could easily abandon. The shift confirms itself through what becomes impossible rather than just difficult. You can't completely forget that you're observing consciousness collapsing reality rather than a separate self experiencing an independent world. You can temporarily contract into that appearance, but you can't genuinely believe it anymore the way you did before restructuring. Neural structures have changed such that the classical worldview no longer fits how the brain processes reality. It's like trying to return to believing the sun orbits Earth after understanding the heliocentric model. You might temporarily think from a geocentric perspective for practical purposes, But you can't genuinely believe it's accurate because understanding has restructured cognition at a level that makes that belief impossible to hold authentically. You also notice cognitive capacities that weren't accessible before restructuring. Ability to perceive probability before collapse. Capacity to recognize observation affecting outcomes in real time. Faculty for sensing the quantum field beneath classical appearance. Competence at navigating reality as participatory process rather than as mechanical system. These aren't abilities you consciously developed through training. These are natural functions of a restructured brain. Cognition structured around quantum understanding naturally perceives and operates with reality's quantum nature in ways classical cognition couldn't access because classical neural organization filtered those capacities out. What's fascinating is that quantum coherence itself appears to increase in the brain after restructuring. Recent studies in quantum neuroscience suggest that microtubules in neurons can maintain quantum coherence for far longer than previously thought possible in warm, wet biological systems. When your understanding shifts to recognize yourself as quantum process rather than separate classical entity, the brain may actually enhance its quantum coherence, creating a feedback loop where quantum understanding creates more quantum function, which deepens quantum understanding. You become what you know yourself to be. 8 years after encountering quantum truth that triggered restructuring, I can't return to genuine unconscious classical worldview. Neural structures have restructured too fundamentally. Classical perception still arises temporarily when consciousness contracts, but I immediately recognize it as limited perspective rather than believing its complete truth. Can't unknow that I'm an observation point collapsing probability rather than a separate self experiencing an objective world. Can't unfeel participation in continuous manifestation process. Can't unsee quantum nature operating beneath classical appearance. The restructuring is permanent change in neural architecture, not temporary intellectual understanding consciousness could abandon. If you're sensing this irreversible restructuring occurring, write in the comments, brain reset confirmed. Not as aspiration for future, but as recognition of transformation currently happening. That neural structures are restructuring around quantum truth. That cognition is shifting from classical to quantum foundation. That the brain is rebuilding architecture for processing reality around more accurate understanding. Even though restructuring creates temporary disorientation, that reset is occurring and will complete in permanent transformation of how consciousness perceives and navigates existence. Every video on this channel points toward quantum understanding from different angles. Every teaching supports brain restructuring around quantum truth, rather than maintaining classical falsehood. Every transmission serves cognitive evolution from limited classical cognition to more accurate quantum comprehension. If these teachings are helping your brain restructure around quantum truth, subscribe, not just to stay connected, but to stay coherent, to remain in this field of consciousness that's actively restructuring. Because the more of us who undergo this great reset, the more the collective field supports it, the more the world itself begins to reflect that truth. Everything shared until now has been building toward this moment. Not a moment in the future when the brain will restructure. This moment right now where restructuring either begins or consciousness remains organized around classical falsehood. Where neural structures either start reconfiguring around quantum truth or maintain architecture based on the false assumption of separate observer experiencing independent objective reality. Where the Great Reset either initiates or gets postponed by consciousness, not ready to allow disruptive but necessary transformation. take a breath, a deep one. And as you breathe, let truth sink deeper. You're not a separate witness watching predetermined reality unfold. You're participating consciousness collapsing the probability field into experienced reality through observation. Before you observe, reality doesn't exist in a definite state. It exists as superposition of all possibilities. Your observation causes collapse from superposition into the definite experience you perceive. You're not discovering what's there. You're determining what appears through observing. Every moment, every experience, everything you perceive exists as experienced definiteness because you're observing and thereby collapsing probability into actuality. Feel that truth. Not just understand it intellectually. Feel how it applies to your direct experience. Right now, you're reading these words because observation is collapsing probability into experienced text. You're aware of your body because observation is collapsing probability into experienced sensations. You're experiencing the room because observation is collapsing probability into experienced environment. None of this exists definitely without observation. All of this emerges from probability through observation that you are performing continuously. You're not passive. You're active. You're participating. You're collapsing reality into existence through observation. In the coming days, notice when the brain tries to revert to classical perception, seeing reality as independent, experiencing self as separate, believing you're just observing what's already there. Each time you notice classical perception arising, gently remind yourself of quantum truth. I'm not a separate witness. I'm participating consciousness collapsing probability through observation. That repeated recognition supports restructuring, not forcing it, not straining toward it, just recognizing truth when classical perception reasserts, allowing recognition to gradually restructure neural structures around accurate understanding rather than false assumption. After this quantum truth, your brain will be reset. Not might be, will be, because truth this fundamental, this incompatible with existing worldview, this directly applicable to your existence, inevitably triggers neural restructuring once comprehended. You can't understand this truth fully and remain neurologically unchanged. The brain must restructure to accommodate understanding that contradicts the foundation all previous cognition was built on. The restructuring has begun, will continue, will complete in permanent transformation of how consciousness perceives reality and navigates existence. If this transmission triggered recognition that you're not a separate witness, but participating consciousness collapsing reality, if truth penetrated beyond intellectual understanding into direct recognition affecting how you perceive experience, if the brain has begun restructuring around quantum understanding, share this. Others need to hear quantum truth stated clearly. Others are ready for restructuring but haven't encountered truth articulated directly enough to trigger the Great Reset. Others would benefit from understanding what's occurring when disorientation begins, allowing restructuring to complete rather than aborting the process through retreat to classical comfort. Drop one word in the comments that captures the energy you're choosing as you step into this Great Reset. One word that represents your intention as restructuring begins. Not a casual comment, but an energetic signature to the quantum field, announcing what you're collapsing into reality through your observation, your participation, your conscious choice. This is you declaring to the field what pattern you're choosing to embody as neural structures rebuild around quantum truth. Write your final comment, just brain restructuring around quantum truth. That statement acknowledges the reset is occurring, that neural structures are rebuilding, that cognition is transforming from classical to quantum foundation, that you're not a separate witness, but participating consciousness collapsing reality through observation. That truth has penetrated sufficiently to trigger permanent change in neural architecture, supporting how consciousness functions. Consider returning to this transmission each morning for the next 7 days. Each time you watch, the quantum truth embeds deeper into neural structure, accelerating the Great Reset. And if someone in your life is ready for this understanding, share this video with them. Not just as information transfer, but as energetic transmission. When you share quantum truth, you're not just helping another consciousness restructure. You're reinforcing your own neural pathways around this understanding, strengthening the morphic field that supports collective awakening, creating synchronicities in the quantum field that accelerate manifestation for both you and them. The act of sharing becomes part of your own restructuring process. This is quantum nexus. This is quantum truth resetting the brain. This is neural restructuring around understanding that you're not separate from the reality you experience, but participating in reality's continuous emergence from the probability field through observation that collapses possibility into actuality. You understand now? Comprehension has occurred. The Great Reset has initiated. Restructuring will complete, and what emerges will be consciousness operating from quantum truth, rather than remaining limited by classical falsehood. After this quantum truth, your brain will be reset. Restructuring is occurring. Neural structures rebuilding around understanding that you're not witness but participant, not separate but entangled, not passive but collapsing reality through observation into experienced actuality from the probability field. That's what you are. Observing consciousness, collapsing reality, participating in creation. Subscribe not just to stay connected, but to stay aligned with this frequency as more of us undergo the Great Reset together. Welcome to Quantum Cognition. Welcome to the Great Reset. Welcome to truth. Now that you recognize yourself as participating consciousness collapsing reality, you need to understand what happens when you stop seeing emotions as reactions and start recognizing them as the actual frequencies broadcasting your reality into form. The moment you grasp emotions as quantum signals rather than psychological responses, you'll witness reality shifting for you in ways that seem impossible from the classical worldview. That transmission is waiting for you next. The recognition that will transform how you navigate the probability field you're now conscious of collapsing.